Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ESIP Wildfire Cluster meeting for it's October 9th, and we have Amanda Mulder, who has recently got a new position at USC, but she's going to be presenting on her PhD work at University of Wisconsin-Madison on wildfire communications and media representation. And super excited for this presentation. So Amanda, take it away.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me, Tim. And it's really nice to meet everyone. I'm excited to share insights about my dissertation research. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. How's that looking?
Looks great.
Great.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. So this is insights from my dissertation research where I really examined how wildfires are communicated in national media and then how those messages are constructed by journalists and how those messages are interpreted by audience and what that really means for broader public understanding and policy. Oops. But before I dive into all that, I want to give a little bit of context of my background and why I'm interested in this topic, both academic and personally. So I grew up in Southern California, and I've actually experienced two major wildfires firsthand. So this is a picture from the Grand Prix fire that happened in 2003, and got very close to burning down my childhood home. And this is a picture from a fire earlier this year that I'm sure we're all familiar with, the Eden Fire in Altadena, California. I was actually staying at my in-laws' house, which is about 10 miles from Altadena, and this was what we could see from their backyard. Wildfires have become more frequent, more destructive, and I've seen firsthand how public understanding of fires can really shape how we respond to them. So I wanted to understand how communication surrounding fire contributes to things like public knowledge, emotion, and ultimately the actions that we take or inactions. So I wanted to ask how media narratives shape our collective understanding about fire. And I really argue that wildfires, they are environmental, ecological events, but they're also involve culture, politics, and they can be deeply symbolic. So understanding how they're represented in media, I think, is essential for shaping more effective and equitable responses to them. And so I really situate the research that I do in these broader conversations about risk and resilience, who is responsible, who gets blamed, and ultimately how we can plan for more future resilience in our warming climate. Theoretically, I use something called the circuit of culture to design and analyze my studies. And so this is really looking at how things like representation, how stories are produced, how they're consumed by audiences, how one's identity kind of comes forth when consuming, and then ultimately like how that shapes regulations. How all these things are kind of happening at the same time and influencing each other in these interconnected systems. So from the media side of things, it's really examining how media narratives are made first, how they're taken up and interpreted by audiences, and then how those meanings shape social norms and policy. And then I mapped on the 3 different studies of my dissertation work into this circuit. So in study 1, I'm looking at representation, and I look at a 20-year sample of US national news and basically look at how fire is represented. And I'll go into more details of all these studies in a second. In study 2, I'm looking at the production element. So how are wildfire narratives produced and, why are they produced the way that they're produced? And then in study 3, I kind of combine the effects of consumption and identity and regulation to explore like the way that stories are framed, the modality in which they occur, how those influence audiences' attitudes, and then how that impacts different preferences for different proposed policies for wildfire mitigation. And some of the key concepts that I engage with in my project in study 1, I'm really looking at different forms of narrative framing. So if something is framed episodically, which means, as like a single episode, as a single event, often, just one thing that happens, versus thematically, which is really tying together lots of different things that happen in a more thematic and systematic way. I also look at the role of accountability or solutions journalism. So how within journalism are specific people or entities or organizations blamed and kind of held accountable for events, or do they focus more on like the solutions and how to look forward? Building on those, in my second study, I'm really examining, some of the narrative strategies that both filmmakers and journalists use in their coverage or in their films, and then what is influencing those decisions, using something called hierarchy of influences that I'll talk about. And then in study 3, I'm kind of combining things that I learned in study 1 and study 2 to really test, like, how are these stories landing with audiences, and what kind of personal identity factors might be moderating those attitudes. And so it leads me to my 3 kind of overarching research questions for the studies and for the project overall. How are wildfires represented in US national news? Research question 2, how do journalists and filmmakers produce wildfire narratives? And 3, how do wildfire narratives influence public perceptions, identity, and support for solutions? So now I'm going to talk about each of the studies in a little bit more detail. So in study 1, this is where I explore how fires are represented in US national news. And I used a methodology called a computational content analysis. So I scraped over 5,000 articles from these 4 national newspapers, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and USA Today, between the years of 2005 and 2023. And using this computational approach, structured topic modeling, which is essentially textual analysis that can identify the most dominant themes that exist within the coverage. And so I did that first, and then followed up with a closer qualitative coding to really understand the kind of the more nuances in the framing, and especially paying attention to if and when blame or solutions are invoked in coverage, how are they invoked, and what actual topics are they talking about. And here are some of the key findings of this study. So first, for overall, the almost 20 years of coverage, it might not be surprising, but really episodic and spectacle-focused framing dominates coverage. So this is really focused on stories that focus on a particular fire, often kind of the more human-centered impacts of a fire. So things like evacuations, number of homes that were destroyed, health risks, fatalities, things like that, kind of the stuff you would expect. And in the early part, the first decade of coverage, I didn't see a lot of thematic or solution framing really at all. But starting around 2018, this type of coverage has increased a lot. It's still marginal compared to the more spectacle episodic framing. But it's topics like tying in the impact of climate change on wildfires, really focusing a lot on negligence by utility companies, especially surrounding, 2018 Camp Fire and PG&E. And then some focus and talk about, longer term risk mitigation strategies. But again, those are kind of overall more rare. And the third thing I found was that coverage patterns tended to vary a lot by geography and time. So in the first 10 years, kind of a small number of total studies, but then really starting around 2015, 16, and in the last 10 years, there's been a pretty significant increase in total volume of coverage. And overall, geographically, stories tend to focus on the American West, California, which probably isn't a surprise. But in the last 5 years, because, these kind of more dramatic wildfire events are occurring lots of different places. So coverage has started to include places like Hawaii, even the East Coast, and the impact of smoke, as well as focusing on international fires, such as, Australian bushfires. And here's just a graph that illustrates this in a little more detail. So again, we could see, the main regions are California, Western US, and North America, LA generally. That's going to be the bulk of the coverage, but then we've seen an increase in stories in other places. So why does this matter? Why do we care about this? We do see that representation of fire is still really reactive, sensational. It often, which can limit the public's ability to understand fire as this more systemic, recurring, and even manageable phenomenon to some degree. And narratives that focus kind of on more humans' coexistence with fire, indigenous stewardship practices, and even ways to prevent, the worst of these events are pretty rare in news coverage, which I would argue can almost restrict the imagination of the public and policymakers in what is even considered as viable options. Okay, now I'm going to talk about study two. So this shifts to the production side, which refers to, how and why people create things such as products, messages, or concepts. And so to examine the production practices, I interviewed 11 journalists and documentary filmmakers. And these are folks who have either extensively reported on wildfires or have created films about fires within the last 2 decades. And to analyze their interview responses, I used this framework called the hierarchy of influences. And this really helped me kind of break down and figure out the different levels of influence that people face when deciding, narrative production, storytelling decisions. So there's like things that you would decide at an individual level, including, your background, your demographics, your traits, things you find interesting. The routine level is more just like your patterns of work that you've learned being in the trade that you're in. An organizational level is the norms of the organization. So that could be the newsroom norms or norms in the documentary filmmaking world. And then these broader external factors are, kind of things beyond just the day to day. And it's like the traditions of what a journalist does, or, relationships that a journalist might have with government or nonprofits or public relations. Okay. And then analyzing the responses and the interviews of these folks, the main things that I found were journalists, especially at big national news organizations, are really heavily constrained by the routines of the newsroom. They also pay a lot of attention to online metrics and audience metrics, and that really that's what leads pretty heavily to this more episodic storytelling style. Whereas filmmakers really have a lot more narrative freedom to tell longer form stories, more systematic stories, thematic stories, but filmmakers face other constraints such as the funding, the time. Often the filmmakers that I talk to, they're not full-time filmmakers. They do a lot of other commercial filmmaking work. So they're constrained in basically resources and being able to tell these types of stories. But for everyone, geography, where they grew up, their background, and often their lived experience and experience directly with fire is what really influenced a lot of their narrative choices. So now I want to share just 2 quotes, one from a journalist and one from a filmmaker that I think illustrate some of these findings a little bit better. So this is a quote from Trevor Hughes, who is a reporter at USA Today. And he said, most media organizations in America are run from the East Coast and are from the East Coast and are run by people from the East Coast. I could call my editors and say that California fell into the ocean today, and my editors would be like, yes, that's unfortunate, but there's also a lot of really bad traffic in New York City today. But I've had both editors who are based in California and editors who are based in Florida or New York or Washington, D.C., who are less focused on wildfires because they're a million miles away. So this is just illustrating that, journalists are only one people. They have editors, and those editors have their own priorities and sometimes biases, and that can really constrain if stories get told about wildfires and what types of stories get told. And then this quote is from Ralph Bloomers, who is a producer on the documentary film Elemental: Reimagining Wildfire. And he said, there's this whole good fire, bad fire thing. We need to have the discussion because mostly for people, fire is bad. So if we get them to think, oh, something can be good, maybe we can get them to think a lot more is good than they currently think. I'm okay with this as a bridge strategy to get to the idea that fire is not good or bad, but fire just is. We tried to be super judicious around this tired old debate in the film Elemental. So I think this is really showing that he, as a filmmaker and as a producer, really has more bandwidth and leeway to kind of integrate some of the nuance and complexity of how humans relate to wildfires. Whereas in news, it's often reporting, the most destructive details that leads to many members of the public having this idea of fires as only disasters and destruction. So why does this matter? This study reveals that production practices can really shape the fire narratives that we see. And they are shaped by things like norms of an organization and personal values. And newsrooms are often really bound to these constraints. And this is what tends to lead to that more episodic storytelling. And then filmmakers is kind of the counterbalance that can really, they have a lot more freedom to tell different types of stories, and they can serve as these translators that really introduce this more systematic, often sometimes Indigenous perspectives on wildfire into the storytelling and films that they make. But again, they do still navigate some of those tensions of what are the professional norms in their field? Do they have enough access to resources to really tell the stories that they want to tell? And then lastly, in study 3, so this is an experiment that I ran where I really wanted to test how framing a story focusing on blaming and accountability or focusing on solution impacted public perceptions in different ways. So this was an experiment with over 1,800 Americans. And this is a little bit more information about the design. So again, I looked at the framing, either blame or solution. And then I also looked at the source of the responsible actor. So really blaming government policy or seeing government policy as a solution, blaming climate change, seeing it as a solution, blaming utility companies or seeing as part of the solution. So everyone got one of 6 different paragraphs that either focused on, the different dimensions that I just outlined. And then everybody saw the same 6-minute piece of media that also talked more about wildfires, but they either read it as text only, they saw text with visual images, or they saw it in the form of a video. Because I also wanted to understand, if we know how to communicate or what message to say, does the modality that it is shown in matter, on these different outcomes that I measured. So I was really looking at how this influenced people's attitudes, how they attributed responsibility to wildfire, their emotional responses, their narrative engagement. And then ultimately what I was interested is their support for some different fire mitigation policies. And what I found with this study is, to my surprise, both the way the message was framed and the modality that it appeared in had really limited effects. It didn't really matter if they saw text or video or if they saw blame or solutions. Kind of the results stayed the same. But the second finding, and what did matter more, is that who was invoked in the message tended to be more effective. So what I found was that participants that were exposed to the narratives that emphasized the utility companies as more responsible actors were more likely to assign blame to utility companies. They were more likely to show increase for mitigation strategies that focused on utility companies, such as burying power lines or insulating utility equipment. And these effects weren't seen with the government policy or climate change. So the utility company aspect of it was really, really strong, which I think makes sense because, a lot of news stories, a lot of fire stories do, not all of them, obviously, but a lot of them do invoke utility companies, or utility companies have been involved, especially in the big destructive fires really in the last 5 to 10 years. And so that seemed to activate kind of what people's expectations were. And then lastly, I also looked at different audience identity factors. So things like one's political ideology, their prior experience with wildfire, and how attached they felt to the place that they lived. And these are a lot more stronger predictors of whether or not people supported these different policies. So to go into that finding a little bit more, this is breaking down the different audience identity factors that I looked at. And I looked at how those factors shaped support for 4 different policies. So fuel thinning, conducting more prescribed burns, fires, burying power lines, and then just this broad, like cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see that across the 4 models, the more like personal and place-based identity were more consistent in predicting wildfire support than the other factors that I looked at, framing, source, or modality. And regional and place-based attachment mattered more for these policies that are more local and vegetation-based, so such as thinning fuel or prescribed fire, whereas political ideology was a lot more influential for things like cutting greenhouse gas emissions, climate mitigation. And so I think this just shows like the importance for accounting for, who you're talking to, where those folks live, what political ideology they might have, what past experiences they've had, can really shape like the types of policies that one might be, promoting and messaging. So why did the findings of this study matter? I think it shows that meaning making is really not just about the message itself, but whatever message is put out there is deeply filtered through one's own personal identity and their past experiences. So the same narrative can shape different responses depending on that audience, their values, what they've experienced in the past. So for ESIP folks, for data folks, like the best wildfire data product will be filtered through that identity. And so, thinking through what type of products to create or exist really needs to focus on like who that audience is, and what they've lived through. So putting everything together, the main summary across the 3 studies, study 1 really shows the dominance of that episodic framing in mainstream media news. And study 2 shows why these patterns continue to persist, illuminating some of the constraints that shape production. And study 3 highlights that the effect of media is really mediated by one's identity and lived experience. So overall, I think my research shows that wildfire narratives are shaped by and can shape cultural meaning across communication. And taken together, I think we can think of wildfire narratives and how they are circulating through the system. So stories are produced by journalists. Those stories are shaped by these institutional boundaries that exist, taken up by audiences, and then that ultimately can inform what policies are seen as possible. And so to make wildfire data impactful, we really must consider how that data and the story that the data is telling, how it aligns or clashes with these existing kind of strongly held cultural narratives. And some practical implications. I think journalists and newsroom can invest in more solution-oriented and thematic framing in reporting to help audiences understand fire as a more long-term policy problem and not just these one-off events. Filmmakers and science communicators that have the skills and the resources can continue to create more of these emotionally resonant stories that acknowledge cultural and also like the ecological complexity around fire events. And policymakers can consider that the interpretation of policy is really shaped and filtered through folks' cultural identities and communication. And so fire resilience strategies must be tailored accordingly. Okay, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much again for inviting me. And I'm really happy to answer any questions, comments about any aspect of this. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Amanda. That was fantastic and enlightening. Dave, do you have a question? Or was that
a few probably, but great presentation, Amanda. Thanks. Let me turn on my camera so I can see. Okay. So I'm just wondering, I mean, based on your research, this is great. What would be your approach if you were covering wildfires and you had access to trusted data that could help with decision making? What would be your approach to, you got to put something together quick, not a filmmaker to put something out in 6 months, but a wildfire breaks out today and you're going to do something on social media or on YouTube or something like that. What's the best approach to use?
Yeah, are you saying if I myself was a journalist or more
Yes.
okay. Yeah, I think like in talking and interviewing these journalists, it seems that because covering wildfire events, include all the logistical challenges that firefighters or first responders or any folks that have to be on the ground and have to be there. So it's really physically challenging. It's quick. You have to get all the right data. And it seems to me what they often rely on are these existing relationships. And often with folks like people in CAL FIRE or these public information officers that they know, and they kind of almost have a template for like, I need information, this, and they know exactly who to go to. And so I think having those like existing relationships that can be built and fostered in non-emergency times would be super beneficial for a journalist. So if I was a journalist, I would want to know like, hey, I know Tim, he has the data I need. We've worked together before. He understands the format that I need it in because this all has to happen quick and I don't have time to vet everything. Like I know talking to journalists, that is a challenge and a constraint that they have of like, I need to have this stuff quick, and so I need to know who to talk to. But on the flip side, that's for folks that report on the ground. There's also people who, there's like one of the people I talked to, his name is Doyle Rice. He's the weather reporter at USA Today. And all of his research is, not his research, sorry, his reporting is really interfacing with, I think it's the national, what is it? The folks in Boise, the national.
National Fire Information Center,
Yeah.
NIFC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he has a great relationship with, I don't know who there, but someone there. And so when he has like, times on the editorial calendar that they know that they want to talk a little bit longer term about, oh, what's going to happen this upcoming fire season, what happened last year. It's a really data driven story. It's not reporting something that's happening, breaking news. He has that existing relationship, knows who to go to, and it's basically like whoever he works with can translate the information for him so that he can put it in a publicly facing, article. And so I think having those relationships and kind of like some understanding and knowledge of the different uh languages that different professions speak, I think is important because, journalists have a lot of constraints and they have specific needs. So I think they go to the people that can fulfill the needs that they have in like a quick, timely manner.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, as a scientist, I'm a trained meteorologist, you want to start with sort of the data and what's happening with the fire, who is it going to be impacting, and why are these fires so, intense? I mean, the news just came out that they just arrested a person after 9 months of research and investigation from Florida that started the Palisades fire. Um, and I see the criminal side of the stories, but I don't see a lot of stories about, okay, someone did set the fire, but why was the fire so intense? Why did it burn so long? Why did it move so quickly? And that points back to climate change, and it points back to what's fueling all of these fires, which is the abundant fuel because of it, everything's drying out. So I guess, I mean, were you advocating in your talk for more newsrooms to have more kind of investigative units where they would focus in on longer term and be able to tell better stories in a shorter amount of time? Because it seems like, every time I watch the national news or local news and they talk about a fire, there's always something else that they should have said that they didn't, but probably because they didn't know, about data that was out there or the right person to talk to, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think when I started this project, I was really like, why don't journalists report more? Like, why don't they make those connections for people about the impact of climate on fire severity? Or, I got kind of frustrated of like, why don't they do this? And then in talking to the journalists, it became more clear to me of just like the number of constraints that they really face in a single journalist, like wanting to report the stories that they want. And the maybe not surprising aspect that almost everyone I talked to told me about was every aspect of any piece that they published is now you have numbers. So how many people clicked on it, how many people read it for 1 second versus 10 seconds, which areas of the article they clicked, and that those metrics heavily influence editorial decisions. And it's kind of like a self-reinforcing system because it's like, well, people click on the arson articles and they want to figure out like who is this guy and what's his background and why did he do it? Because it becomes a more entertaining, almost true crime story, and they're less likely to click on the other types of stories. And ultimately, newsrooms and journalists, they have advertisers, it's a business, they have to keep the lights on. So they're at a little bit of the mercy of, what is the audience actually reading? But all that being said, like, um, the campfire and the PG&E involvement in it became a huge story that every mainstream and local news organizations covered. And because it had this combination of, all the metrics were so extreme for the campfire and then this involvement with PG&E, it kind of had all the pieces of like a really engaging news story that people were really interested in. And because of that, journalists that wanted to keep covering it like got the leeway to go back and see Paradise, a month later, 5 months later, a year later, and do these follow-up stories that usually never happens with mainstream media. They cover a fire and then they move on. And so yeah, I don't, it's a mix of like economic viability, news values, what makes something news. It's timely, it's shocking. People say the kind of horrible phrase, like if it bleeds, it leads. And so those are all like things at play that journalists have to kind of contend with, which is why like I wanted to talk to filmmakers because it seems like even though they have kind of their own whole other production constraints, like you were saying, it takes months, maybe years to make a film. So you can't be as timely about things, but that allows you to actually slow down and be able to tell kind of these longer term, longer form stories that have a lot more nuance to them. But then, the problem is also like, well, is anyone going to watch it? So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. I appreciate that. I'll open it up to others that might have questions too. I really appreciate it, Amanda. Might want to follow up with you too. I don't know if you had your email address on your slides, but maybe put it in the chat so we can get back in touch with you as well.
Yeah. Oops.
Yeah, I had a question, Amanda, specifically about, I work in rural wildfire affected landscapes, and the emergence of rural news deserts is really prominent. And one of the things that throughout the thinking about your work, the the actual I'm gonna say it's associated with ratings, but the market dynamics that are at work within the news media, there's kind of this parallel infrastructure emerging in rural places that are dominated by social media content. And from what I've seen, the wildfire driven stories are actually get traction with communities, and there's places in which the these are like high impact stories for communities, and there's like emerging voices like from like subject matter experts who are managing podcasts that are actually like becoming dominant creators of narrative, and I wonder if that is something that you're looking at in the future as a topic.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and question, because within these rural news deserts, I guess that's like the official term. I don't know. People have done research on this. I haven't done any official research myself, but just talking to folks, like actually one of the filmmakers that I talked to, Michael Sherman, he's based kind of in more rural Oregon, and so he's talked a lot about basically exactly what you're talking about. Like there's because there's kind of a lack of official information, the need for information kind of gets filled by various actors, sometimes people on social media, podcasts, sometimes people in kind of these more official capacities, often just people who have opinions that other people kind of have this confirmation bias, like, oh, you're saying what I believe, so that's right. And then you kind of get sucked into this filter bubble echo chamber where everyone is saying the same thing to reinforce your existing beliefs. But yeah, I don't know. It like there's a lot of benefits to things like, vertical videos on social media, podcasts, because they're cheap to make. They can be a lot more accessible, depending on the format. Like videos can give you a quick snippet of something. Podcasts can go a lot deeper into a topic, get a lot more nuanced. But no one is held to any type of journalistic or editorial standards with whatever they put out at all. Like there's no fact checking. So hence like disinformation can occur pretty easily. So it seems, I don't know, it's a double-edged thing. It's like it's filling this need that exists, but like, can that information be trusted? Is it vetted? Clearly, like, I don't know if you all listen to podcasts. I listen to podcasts, and whoever I listen to, you kind of develop this parasocial relationship with. Like, you feel like you know the person because you hear them talk. And so maybe you tend to trust them more than you would someone else, whether or not what they're saying, speaks to reality. So I don't know. I mean, I think my personal opinion is that it should be a tandem thing. Like we need funding and we need smaller town and rural journalists. Like that is important and that can't be replaced by podcasts or social media influencers. But to develop these kind of niche audiences, to get more diversity of voices, podcasts and things like that can exist too. I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, there's a related thing that where Cal Fire specifically, as being a large, they say it's the largest fire department in the world. They've invested heavily in communications teams that have actually been recruited specifically out of the television journalism space. And it's been an interesting thing seeing what their communication system has developed, but it's short content, and it's not the depth that some high quality journalism necessarily is, but they have a production schedule which is significant, but they're also not necessarily, they don't, as a government agency that has a kind of a horse in the race, shall we say, they can't be trusted in the same way that historically we might have trusted independent journalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will. One thing with Cal Fire that I learned in interviewing all these journalists is that, like, Cal Fire is one of the only, maybe the only fire organization that actively like trains journalists to have like firefighting training, and so that they can speak the language of kind of how firefighters speak and know actually like how fire behavior works or where to go when you're covering stories. And it's the only state that has a law where journalists can like also pass the fire line. In other states, journalists must stay behind it. And so, the journalists that covered California pretty extensively told me that, because they said that that could be a reason why there's just, other than the frequency of fires in California, it's also just like a different media ecosystem that CAL FIRE has set up in partnership with journalists that allows that coverage to happen. And so that could be a constraint in other states of why journalists can't get the coverage or the nuance or the quotes or the angle, of the fire that they want, which can restrict the coverage there. So I just thought that was interesting, and that kind of goes back to like those built-in relationships and ecosystems, so that when the fire itself happens, like all of that stuff is already set up. And because, during a fire, it's like there's a million things going on. So you're not going to try to, I don't know, negotiate your way behind a fire line or something if that's the law. But yeah.
Yeah, actually, just today or yesterday, I got the Oregon has Oregon copied California's law in around 2023.
Oh,
And actually, their Oregon State University just published a manual for journalists to intersect with incident teams, which was, something I think was learned from the Cal Fire experience.
cool. That's great.
Um, let's see. Well,
I had
I'm
a
curious where you're going next with this work. Well, I'm not clear on your role at USC, but are you seeing next steps for this research?
Yeah. And I'm happy to answer that. Did you have a question, Alicia?
yeah, I had put it in the chat, but I was just kind of curious about I mean, it seems like CAL FIRE has a good established relationship with journalists, but I was thinking about or have you looked at scientists or natural resource professionals being proactive in terms of establishing those relationships? Because you mentioned journalists talking to or having a point of contact if there's a fire because they need to act quickly. If you're seeing that reverse, I guess, relationship where scientists or those resource managers are actually approaching journalists to be like, "Hey, we do work in this space. If you have questions," I don't know what that might look like, but I was just curious if you had looked at that as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. And as someone who's studied science communication and also thinks about like how, if, and when scientists like should and interface in public ways, a lot of it, like, I don't think there's a template necessarily of like how to do that, and a lot of it probably depends on what type of science, like, well, and I guess to kind of answer Tim's question also at the same time, so at USC I'm working in the Wrigley Institute for Environment and Sustainability, so basically like their environmental studies program. And I'm with this group that is a mix of natural scientists, earth scientists, social scientists, and we're researching kind of like different new carbon management technologies. And so it's not totally 100% fire related, although I hope to get back to fire research later. But the question is, it's like, where and when does your science intersect with something that is relevant to the public? Like if you're doing kind of more basic science and science for science sake, like that's amazing and we need that. That might not really be relevant in this case. But in the case of anyone doing research about fire related things, like there is a ton of relevance for the public, I would assume, depending on what the research or the data is. And so it's thinking about like, okay, here's the science I have, here's what it's telling me, and then really trying to think through and like translate that into packageable products that would be relevant to whoever you want to talk to. So for journalists, it's like, well, what do journalists need? Journalists need quick, easy, verifiable information, someone that they can trust. They need something that's timely, that's relevant, that it catches people's attention. So how can I think about what I'm doing and package it in that way? And then it's like sometimes, depending on your organization, like maybe you have this intermediary like communication team, and that person, they can be kind of the group between you as a scientist and the journalist to say, like, let's translate your science into a way that's easy to understand, and then I can be the one to package that and send that to the journalist. So it really depends on, your organization. Some scientists are really comfortable like talking directly to the media and being interviewed. Some folks don't like doing stuff like that. So I don't know. I'm basically just telling you, like, there's a lot of different ways that it could happen, but I think one key thing too is like really thinking about kind of where, like, geographically, locally, where you are and maybe where your science is, and how is it relevant for that community. I feel like that stuff is really important, and those more local people want to share that information with audiences that actually would care about it.
Great, thank you.
I think that your observation about identity as being the strongest filter of the response to your kind of your content was kind of fascinating. And I'm curious if there are any strategies for managing content that is adaptive to identities, political identities that are at work in regions.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot currently, just in the context of Los Angeles and these LA fires, because we're kind of in this moment here locally in Southern California where, like, the geographic identity is kind of making lots of folks very interested in fire related content, regardless of maybe politics or how, all these different other identity factors. It's just like, if you live in this LA region and you experienced any aspects of these two fires that happened in January, like, you're kind of, I mean, maybe not everyone, but it seems like there's a lot more news stories. And I also might just be primed to be receiving all those news stories because I'm interested, but I feel like I've seen so much coverage about these fires in LA Times, of course, but in national news, because it's like journalists kind of have this past right now of like, oh, people are really interested in this, so we can write more stories about it right now. And so, that kind of speaks to that more like previous fire experience, lived experience aspect of it. Yeah, I don't know. The politics, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I'm not gonna touch that one. I don't know.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I think it depends. And often, like, what I've learned is, as a journalist, as a news reporter, as a storyteller, it's like trying to figure out when is like having these kind of stories or things you want to tell, and then figuring out like when is the most appropriate moment. Like, when are people really primed to want to read this? And with fire coverage, like, there used to be some semblance of this like fire season, and people would be kind of primed at these different times of the years to want to read fire stories. But that is kind of out the window because they happen all year. So I think it's like, I don't know, yeah, more geographic and regional to some extent. But yeah.
I mean, one question, because you mentioned in your presentation, a lot of reporting started in California or the western part of the United States, but then as more fires getting into other parts of the country, then you see more reportings for those fires as well. So have you seen a general trend, or still the lack of the coverage of these reportings and stories about fire in the eastern parts of the United States?
Yeah, it's like, I've seen mostly these big fires that happen in California are still the dominant geographic area of coverage. But I know like 2023 actually, and it's just these 4 national newspapers, but that had the largest volume of wildfire stories of any year. And I was a little surprised to see that, because then I looked at the data, and 2023 from like a total number of fires perspective was actually pretty low compared to other years. But it was mostly driven by the Canadian wildfires and then the smoke that just blanketed the East Coast. And then, of course, most of these journalists or editors are based on the East Coast, and it became a really big story that got a ton of news coverage because it was like affecting people's day-to-day lives. You know, these pictures of an orange sky in New York City and all the smoke and stuff. And so I think like as fires are happening with more geographic diversity, but also like impacting people kind of across the US. I think in the past, maybe there was a little bit of a stereotype of like, oh yeah, you know, fires, that happens in the West, and, you know, hurricanes happen here and floods happen here. And it's been kind of like, this is the thing that we deal with here. And now all sorts of events, extreme events are happening lots of different places and affecting people. And so I think that's just like kind of the future situation that we're living, which drives more, you know, and especially in those cases, it's like the novelty of it. It's like, wow, New York City usually isn't blanketed in a layer of smoke. This doesn't happen. And so novelty is like a huge news value. If something is new and different and it's never happened before, it gets a ton of news coverage. And then the counterfactual to that, a lot, like 5 different journalists mentioned to me, they were like, you know, fires burn all summer long in Alaska every year, and you never read about it because it's not affecting many humans. And so it's not only that like a fire happens or how large it is, but it's really like, how is it impacting people? And that tends to be the number one reason like why a fire gets covered or doesn't get covered.
All right. Well, we're coming up on the hour, and I did want to thank you so much for this presentation. It's been, I'm going to be digging through your papers very seriously. This was really enlightening. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the talk and the conversation. And if there's any follow-up questions, I put my email in the chat. I'd be happy to answer questions or just stay in touch. So yeah.
Oh,
I just
thank you
wanted
so
to say
much.
real quick, you did a really just such a great presentation, such great information. Yeah, I'm really glad that I took time to watch you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.